The morning sun shone through the tall windows of Harvard University's biggest lecture hall. Dr. Richard Hamilton walked across the stage with confident steps. He was a man in his late 50s with gray hair and thick glasses. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, and he carried himself like someone who had spent 30 years teaching at one of the world's best universities. Today was special. The lecture hall was packed with people from all over the country. Math professors, graduate students, and researchers had come to hear Dr. Hamilton talk about a problem that had been puzzling mathematicians for decades. The seats were filled with some of the smartest people in America, all eager to hear what the famous professor had to say. Dr. Hamilton placed his papers on the wooden podium and looked out at the crowd. He had given thousands of lectures in his career, but this one felt different. Today, he was going to talk about something that had consumed his thoughts for the past 5 years, something that he believed could never be solved. The problem was about numbers. Not just any numbers, but special ones called prime numbers. These are numbers that can only be divided by themselves and 1. Numbers like 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and 13. For hundreds of years, mathematicians had tried to find a pattern in how these numbers appeared. It was like trying to predict where lightning would strike next. Dr. Hamilton began his presentation by showing charts and graphs on the big screen behind him. The audience watched closely as he explained how many brilliant minds had tried to solve this puzzle. He talked about famous mathematicians from history who had spent their entire lives working on similar problems. His voice was strong and clear as he walked through each failed attempt. The professor showed complicated equations that filled the entire screen. Most people in the audience nodded along, understanding the complex math. They had spent years studying these kinds of problems. But even for them, some of the work was hard to follow. Dr. Hamilton had a way of making difficult things sound even more difficult. In the back corner of the lecture hall, there was a small group that looked very different from the rest of the audience. Lisa Carter, a third-grade teacher from a local elementary school, sat with 9 of her students. The children were part of a special math club for gifted kids. Ms. Carter had thought it would be good for them to see what real mathematicians did, even if they couldn't understand everything. Most of the 9-year-olds were having trouble staying awake. The math was way beyond anything they had learned in school. Some of them drew pictures in their notebooks. Others stared out the windows at the trees outside. But one boy was different. Jake Miller sat on the edge of his seat, watching every move Dr. Hamilton made. Jake was a quiet kid with messy brown hair and bright blue eyes. He was smaller than most kids his age, but his mind worked in ways that surprised everyone around him. While his classmates were bored, Jake was fascinated. He didn't understand all the big words or complicated equations, but something about the problem caught his attention. Dr. Hamilton continued his presentation for over an hour. He showed the audience every approach that had been tried. He explained why each method had failed. The more he talked, the more convinced he became that he was right. This problem was impossible to solve. The professor's voice grew stronger as he reached the main point of his lecture. He looked directly at the audience and said the words that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, after 5 years of intensive research, I can say with complete confidence that this problem is mathematically impossible to solve with our current understanding. The room was completely silent. Even the graduate students who usually asked lots of questions sat quietly. Dr. Hamilton had built his reputation on being right about these kinds of things. If he said something was impossible, most people believed him. Jake shifted in his seat. Something didn't feel right to him about what the professor was saying. He couldn't explain it in fancy math terms, but his gut told him there was something missing. He had always been good at seeing patterns that others missed. In school, he could solve puzzles that stumped his teachers. But this was different. This was Harvard University, and he was just a 9-year-old kid. Ms. Carter noticed Jake's intense focus and whispered to him, "Are you understanding any of this?" Jake nodded slowly, though he couldn't really explain what he was thinking. There was something about the way Dr. Hamilton was looking at the problem that seemed wrong to Jake. It reminded him of times when he got stuck on homework and needed to try a completely different approach. Dr. Hamilton began to wrap up his presentation. He thanked the audience for their attention and said he hoped his research would help other mathematicians understand the limits of what was possible. The applause was polite but not enthusiastic. Everyone respected Dr. Hamilton's work, but the conclusion was disappointing. People had hoped for a breakthrough, not a declaration of defeat. As the clapping died down, Dr. Hamilton asked if there were any questions. This was the part of academic lectures where professors and graduate students showed off their knowledge by asking complex questions. Hands shot up around the room. Dr. Hamilton pointed to a woman in the front row, then to a man with a beard, then to a young graduate student with thick glasses. Each question was long and filled with technical terms. Dr. Hamilton answered them all with confidence, using each question as another chance to explain why the problem couldn't be solved. The back and forth went on for 20 minutes. Jake listened to every word, even though he understood very little of what was being said. The questions were starting to slow down when something unexpected happened. In the back of the room, a small hand slowly rose into the air. Jake Miller, barely visible behind the adult sitting in front of him, was raising his hand. He waited patiently, hoping the professor would notice him. Ms. Carter saw what Jake was doing and felt a moment of panic. She whispered urgently, "Jake, put your hand down. This isn't the place for that." But Jake kept his hand up. He had something to say, and he wasn't going to give up. Dr. Hamilton was answering another question when he caught sight of the small hand in the back. He paused mid-sentence, surprised to see a child in his audience. The other professors and graduate students turned to look at what had caught his attention. A murmur went through the crowd as they realized a little boy wanted to ask a question at this serious academic event. Dr. Hamilton stopped talking and stared at the back of the room. He had been answering questions for the past 20 minutes, but this was different. All the other questions had come from professors and graduate students who knew exactly what to ask. Now there was a small hand in the air, attached to a boy who couldn't be more than 9 years old. The entire lecture hall turned to look. Hundreds of heads swiveled around to see what had caught the professor's attention. Some people smiled when they saw Jake. Others looked confused about why a child was at such a serious academic event. A few professors frowned, thinking this was inappropriate. Jake kept his hand up even though he could feel everyone staring at him. His heart was beating fast, but he didn't put his hand down. Ms. Carter, his teacher, was whispering urgently for him to stop, but Jake pretended not to. Hear her. He had something important to say and he wasn't going to let fear stop him. Dr. Hamilton wasn't sure what to do. In 30 years of teaching, he had never had a child ask a question at one of his advanced lectures. He looked around the room and saw some of his colleagues shaking their heads slightly, as if to say he should ignore the boy and move on. But something about the determined look on Jake's face made him curious. "Yes, young man," Dr. Hamilton said, his voice carrying a tone that was polite but also a little condescending. He was the kind of person who was always nice to children, but who also thought they should stick to children's things. "Do you have a question?" Jake stood up on his chair so everyone could see him better. The lecture hall was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Even the professors who had been whispering to each other stopped talking. Everyone wanted to hear what this little boy was going to say. "Professor?" Jake said in a clear voice that surprised everyone with how confident. It sounded, "What if you looked at the pattern backwards instead of forwards? My mom always says when I can't solve a puzzle, I should try working from the end to the beginning." The moment Jake finished speaking, the room erupted in laughter. It wasn't mean laughter, but it was the kind of gentle chuckling that adults do when a child says something they think is cute but wrong. Some professors covered their mouths to hide their smiles. Graduate students looked at each other with amused expressions. Even Ms. Carter felt embarrassed for her student. Dr. Hamilton's smile was the kind adults give to children when they want to be encouraging, but also want to teach them that the adult world is more complicated than they understand. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at Jake with what he thought was kindness. "That's a very creative thought, son," Dr. Hamilton said, his voice now sounding like he was talking to a much younger child. "But mathematics doesn't work quite that way. This isn't a simple puzzle you might find in a children's book or a magazine. This is advanced number theory that has challenged the greatest minds in mathematics for decades. Jake felt his cheeks turn red, but not from embarrassment. He was frustrated. He could see that the professor wasn't really listening to what he had said. Dr. Hamilton was treating him like a little kid who didn't understand anything, but Jake knew his idea made sense. He had solved lots of hard puzzles by working backwards, and he couldn't understand why that wouldn't work with numbers too. "But Professor," Jake said, still standing on his chair, "have you actually tried it? Working backwards, I mean?" This time the laughter was a little louder. Some people were starting to get impatient. They had come to hear serious mathematics, not to watch a child ask silly questions. Dr. Hamilton raised his hand to quiet the crowd, but his expression showed that he was losing patience too. "Young man, I appreciate your enthusiasm," Dr. Hamilton said, "but the approach you're suggesting shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how mathematical research works. We don't just try random ideas and hope they work. Every method we use is based on centuries of mathematical knowledge and rigorous logical thinking." Jake looked around the room and saw that most people were nodding in agreement with the professor. Some were even looking annoyed that he was taking up time. But Jake wasn't ready to give up. His mind was racing with ideas about the problem, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing something obvious. Ms. Carter tugged on Jake's shirt, trying to get him to sit down. She was mortified that her student was arguing with a Harvard professor in front of hundreds of people. She had brought her class here to inspire them, not to let them embarrass themselves. But Jake gently pulled away from her and kept standing. "I know you're really smart," Jake said to Dr. Hamilton, "and I know you know way more about math than I do. But what if being really smart sometimes makes it harder to see simple answers? What if the reason no one has solved this problem is because everyone is thinking about it the same way?" The laughter died down as people realized the boy was being serious. Some professors in the front row were starting to look uncomfortable. This wasn't how these events were supposed to go. A few graduate students were whispering to each other, wondering if someone should do something to end this disruption. Dr. Hamilton felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Not agreement exactly, but a tiny moment of doubt. He had spent so many years being the expert, being the one with all the answers, that he rarely questioned his own methods. But there was something in the boy's voice that was different from the usual academic questions he received. It wasn't trying to show off or impress anyone. It was just genuine curiosity. Still, Dr. Hamilton was a professor at Harvard University. He had published dozens of papers and won awards for his research. He wasn't going to let a 9-year-old boy make him doubt 5 years of intensive work. "I understand that you want to help," Dr. Hamilton said, his voice becoming firmer. "But mathematical research isn't something you can approach with simple childhood logic. The methods we use have been developed and refined by some of the most brilliant people who have ever lived. If there was a simple solution like working backwards, don't you think someone would have found it by now?" Jake felt the weight of all those eyes staring at him. He knew he was just a kid, and he knew these were some of the smartest people in the world. But he also knew what his gut was telling him, and it was telling him that everyone in this room was wrong about something important. "Maybe," Jake said quietly, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. "But maybe being the smartest people makes it harder to think like someone who doesn't know all the rules about what's supposed to be impossible." The room fell completely silent. Dr. Hamilton stared at the boy for a long moment. Part of him wanted to end this conversation right now and move on to serious questions from serious people. But another part of him, a part he hadn't listened to in years, was wondering if there might be something worth considering in what this child was saying. Finally, Dr. Hamilton cleared his throat and looked away from Jake. "Well," he said to the entire audience, "I think we've spent enough time on this topic. Are there any other questions about the actual mathematical content of my presentation?" Several hands shot up immediately, and Dr. Hamilton pointed to a professor in the third row who began asking a complex question about computational limits. The academic discussion resumed as if Jake had never spoken at all. But Jake remained standing on his chair for another minute, staring at Dr. Hamilton with an expression that was part disappointment and part determination. Ms. Carter finally managed to convince him to sit down, But Jake's mind was already working on the problem in ways that none of the brilliant adults around him could imagine. The ride home from Harvard was very quiet. Jake sat in the back seat of Ms. Carter's van, staring out the window as they drove through the busy streets of Cambridge. The other kids from his math club were talking and laughing about their day, but Jake wasn't listening to them. His mind was still back in that lecture hall thinking about numbers and patterns and the way Dr. Hamilton had looked at him. Ms. Carter kept glancing at Jake in her rearview mirror. She felt bad about what had happened. She had brought her students to Harvard to inspire them, not to let them be embarrassed in front of hundreds of people. But she also knew Jake well enough to see that he wasn't upset about being laughed at. He looked like he was thinking very hard about something. When they got back to school, the other kids ran off to catch their buses home. Jake walked slowly to his locker, still lost in thought. Ms. Carter caught up with him before he left. "Jake," she said gently, "are you okay? I know that was probably embarrassing back there." Jake looked up at her with those bright blue eyes that always seemed to see more than other kids his age. "Ms. Carter, do you think Dr. Hamilton was right? Do you think some problems really are impossible to solve?" Ms. Carter wasn't sure how to answer. She didn't want to discourage Jake, but she also didn't want him to think he could solve problems that had stumped the world's best mathematicians. "Well, Jake, some problems are very, very hard. Maybe impossible isn't the right word. But some things might take hundreds of years to figure out." Jake nodded, but Ms. Carter could tell he wasn't really satisfied with her answer. He said goodbye and walked out to wait for his mom to pick him up. That evening at dinner, Jake couldn't stop talking about the lecture. His parents, Bill and Amy Miller, listened patiently as their son tried to explain the mathematical problem he had heard about. Bill was a construction worker who built houses, and Amy was a nurse at the local hospital. Neither of them had studied advanced mathematics, but they could see how excited Jake was. "So this professor guy thinks nobody can solve this number puzzle?" Bill asked, trying to follow along. "He doesn't just think it," Jake said, waving his fork in the air. "He told everyone it was impossible. But Dad, what if it's not? What if he's just looking at it wrong?" Amy smiled at her son's enthusiasm. Jake had always been like this. When he got interested in something, he couldn't let it go. She remembered when he was 6 and became obsessed with taking apart old radios to see how they worked. He had filled their garage with broken electronics before he finally figured out how to put them back together. "Honey," Amy said, "that professor has been studying math for probably longer than you've been alive. Are you sure you understood the problem correctly?" Jake nodded vigorously. "I understood enough. It's about finding patterns in special numbers. And Mom, you always tell me that when I can't solve something, I should try a different way. Remember when I couldn't build that model airplane because I kept trying to start with the wings? You told me to try starting with something else, and then it worked." Bill and Amy looked at each other across the dinner table. They were proud of their son's confidence, but they were also worried. They didn't want him to get his hopes up about something that might be too big for a 9-year-old to handle. After dinner, Jake went up to his room and pulled out a notebook. He had lots of notebooks filled with drawings and ideas and math problems he made up for himself. But this time was different. This time he was going to work on something real, something that mattered. Jake started by writing down everything he could remember from Dr. Hamilton's lecture. He drew the charts he had seen on the big screen, even though he couldn't remember all the numbers exactly. He wrote down the words prime numbers and tried to remember what Dr. Hamilton had said about them. For the next 3 hours, Jake filled page after page with numbers and patterns. He wrote down all the prime numbers he could think of: 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23. Then he started looking at them in different ways. What if he looked at the spaces between them? What if he added them up in different combinations? What if he worked backwards from big prime numbers to small ones? When his parents came to check on him at bedtime, they found Jake surrounded by crumpled papers and notebooks. His desk was covered with pencils and erasers, and he had numbers written on sticky notes that he had stuck all over his wall. "Jake, it's time for bed," Amy said. "You can work on this more tomorrow." "But Mom, I think I'm starting to see something," Jake said without looking up from his notebook. "Look at this pattern here. When I work backwards from this number to This number, something interesting happens. Amy looked at the page Jake was pointing to, but all she saw was a mess of numbers and arrows. Sweetie, I can't understand any of this. You need to get some sleep. Reluctantly, Jake put his pencil down and got ready for bed. But even after his parents turned off the lights, he lay in bed thinking about numbers. He could see patterns in his mind, like pictures made of mathematics. It was exciting and frustrating at the same time, because he knew he was onto something but couldn't quite figure out what it was. The next day at school, Jake had trouble paying attention to his regular classes. During math class, which was usually his favorite subject, he kept thinking about prime numbers instead of the simple addition and subtraction problems his teacher was giving the class. During reading time, he drew number patterns in the margins of his book. Ms. Carter noticed that Jake seemed distracted, but she didn't say anything. She figured he was probably still thinking about what had happened at Harvard, and she hoped he would get over it soon. But Jake wasn't getting over it. If anything, he was becoming more obsessed. Every day after school, he went straight to his room and worked on the problem. He filled notebook after notebook with his ideas. Some of his approaches didn't work at all. Others seemed promising but led to dead ends. But Jake kept trying. His parents started to worry. Jake was spending all his free time on this mathematical problem, and they could see it was consuming his thoughts. Amy tried to suggest other activities like going to the park or watching a movie, but Jake wasn't interested. "I'm close to something, Mom," he would say. "I can feel it." Bill and Amy didn't know what to do. They were proud that their son was so dedicated, but they were also concerned that he was setting himself up for disappointment. How could a 9-year-old solve a problem that Harvard professors couldn't solve? 2 weeks after the Harvard lecture, something changed. Jake was working in his room as usual when he suddenly stopped writing and stared at his notebook. He had been trying a new approach, looking at prime numbers in groups and working backwards through the patterns, when he noticed something that made his heart race. "Mom! Dad!" Jake yelled, running downstairs with his notebook clutched in his hands. "Come look at this, I think I found something." Bill and Amy dropped what they were doing and followed Jake to the kitchen table. Jake spread out his notebook and started explaining what he had discovered, talking so fast that his words tumbled over each other. "See, everyone has been trying to predict where the next prime number will be by looking forward from the numbers. We already know," Jake said, his finger tracing lines across the page. "But what if you start with a really big prime number and work backwards? What if you look at the pattern of how the spaces between prime numbers change when you go in reverse?" His parents stared at the pages covered with numbers and arrows and diagrams that looked like spider webs made of mathematics. They couldn't understand any of it, but they could see that Jake was more excited than they had ever seen him. "Honey, this looks very complicated," Amy said. "Are you sure you're on the right track?" Jake nodded eagerly. "I think so, Mom. But I need to check it with more numbers. I need to make sure it works with really big prime numbers, not just the small ones I've been using." That night, Jake stayed up later than his parents had ever allowed, working with a calculator he had borrowed from his dad's toolbox. He was checking his backwards pattern with larger and larger numbers, and each time he tried it, the pattern held true. By midnight, Jake was absolutely certain he had found something important. Something that might change the way people thought about Dr. Hamilton's impossible problem. Ms. Carter was grading papers in her classroom when her phone rang. It was Amy Miller, Jake's mother, and she sounded worried and excited at the same time. "Ms. Carter, I'm sorry to bother you at school, but I need to ask you something about Jake," Amy said. "He's been working on that math problem from Harvard for 3 weeks now, and he says he's found something important. He wants to show it to someone who understands mathematics, but Bill and I can't make sense of any of it." Ms. Carter put down her red pen and listened carefully. She had been wondering how Jake was doing since the Harvard lecture. She had hoped he would forget about the embarrassing moment and move on to other things, but apparently that wasn't happening. "What kind of work has he been doing?" Ms. Carter asked. "He's filled 7 notebooks with numbers and diagrams," Amy explained. "He stays up late every night working on it. Last night he was so excited he couldn't sleep. He keeps saying he's found a pattern that works backwards, whatever that means. I'm worried he's becoming obsessed, but I'm also wondering if maybe he really has found something." Ms. Carter thought about this for a moment. She knew Jake was a special kid with a gift for seeing patterns, but solving a problem that had stumped Harvard professors seemed impossible. Still, she cared about Jake and wanted to help him either way. "I'll tell you what," Ms. Carter said. "I have a friend from college who teaches mathematics at the university. Her name is Dr. Patricia Wong. Maybe she could take a look at Jake's work and help us figure out if he's on the right track or if we need to help him move on to something else." Amy felt relieved. "That would be wonderful. I don't want to crush his dreams, but I also don't want him to waste his childhood chasing something impossible." That afternoon, Ms. Carter called her old college roommate. Patricia Wong had been her best friend in school, and they had stayed in touch over the years. Dr. Wong was now a professor of mathematics at the State University, about an hour away from where Jake lived. "Patricia, I need your help with something unusual," Ms. Carter said. "I have a 9-year-old student who thinks he's solved a famous mathematical problem. I know it sounds crazy, but would you be willing to look at his work? His parents are worried, and I want to help them handle this situation properly." Dr. Wong was curious. She had heard stories about child prodigies in mathematics, though they were extremely rare. "What problem does he think he solved?" She asked. Ms. Carter tried to explain what she remembered from the Harvard lecture, though she admitted she hadn't understood most of it. Dr. Wong recognized the problem immediately. It was one of the famous unsolved puzzles in number theory, and she knew Dr. Hamilton's reputation well. "I'll be happy to look at the boy's work," Dr. Wong said. "But Lisa, you should prepare the family for the likelihood that he hasn't actually solved anything. Sometimes very bright children think they've made discoveries when they've actually just found patterns that mathematicians already know about, or made errors they don't recognize." The next Saturday, Dr. Wong drove to Jake's house. She was a small woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle way of speaking. When she arrived, she found Jake waiting for her at the kitchen table with a stack of notebooks and loose papers spread out in front of him. Jake's parents hovered nearby, not sure what to expect. They had cleaned the house and made coffee for Dr. Wong, treating her visit like an important event. Jake, meanwhile, seemed surprisingly calm for a 9-year-old who was about to show his work to a real professor. "Hi, Jake," Dr. Wong said, sitting down across from him. "I hear you've been working on a very difficult mathematical problem. Would you like to show me what you've discovered?" Jake nodded and opened his first notebook. "Dr. Wong, everyone has been trying to find patterns in prime numbers by looking forward from small numbers to big numbers, but I think they're doing it backwards. They should be doing it backwards. Jake paused, trying to find the right words. "What I mean is, they should start with big prime numbers and work their way back to small ones." Dr. Wong listened patiently as Jake began to explain his approach. At first, she thought it would be easy to spot the error in his reasoning. Child prodigies often made simple mistakes that they didn't recognize because they hadn't studied enough advanced mathematics to know what they didn't know. But as Jake continued his explanation, Dr. Wong found herself leaning forward in her chair. The boy's approach was unusual, and some of his reasoning was surprisingly sophisticated. He was using intuitive methods that reminded her of techniques she had studied in graduate school. "Show me how this works with specific numbers," Dr. Wong said, pulling out her own notebook. Jake became animated, flipping through pages and pointing to different calculations. He showed Dr. Wong how he had tested his backwards pattern with dozens of different prime numbers. He explained how the spaces between primes revealed different information when you looked at them in reverse order. Dr. Wong followed along, checking Jake's arithmetic as he went. She expected to find mistakes, but Jake's calculations were correct. More importantly, his basic insight about reversing the traditional approach was mathematically sound. It wasn't just a childish idea. It was a legitimate mathematical strategy that could potentially yield new information. After 2 hours of going through Jake's work, Dr. Wong sat back in her chair with a stunned expression. Jake looked at her hopefully while his parents watched nervously from across the room. "Jake," Dr. Wong said slowly, "I think you may have found something very important. Your approach is completely valid, and some of your results are, well, they're remarkable. But I need to check this more thoroughly with advanced mathematical tools before I can be sure." Jake's face lit up. Does that mean I might be right? Does that mean the problem might not be impossible? Dr. Wong chose her words carefully. It means you've found a new way to look at this problem that could be very significant. But Jake, even if you're right, it will take a lot more work to turn your discovery into a complete solution. And there's still a chance that when we dig deeper, we'll find problems with the approach. Jake nodded seriously. I understand. But you think it's worth checking out? I absolutely think it's worth checking out, Dr. Wong said. In fact, I think we need to contact Dr. Hamilton at Harvard and show him what you found. Amy and Bill looked at each other in amazement. They had been prepared for Dr. Wong to gently explain to Jake that he was mistaken. They had never imagined that a real professor would say their 9-year-old son might have made a genuine mathematical discovery. Are you serious? Bill asked. You really think Jake found something important? Dr. Wong nodded. I can't make any promises, but yes, I think Jake may have identified a flaw in the traditional approach to this problem. His insight about working backwards is not just clever, it's mathematically sound and potentially groundbreaking. Over the next week, Dr. Wong worked intensively with Jake's discovery. She used computer programs to test his backwards pattern with much larger prime numbers than Jake could calculate by hand. She applied advanced mathematical proofs to check whether his insight held up under rigorous analysis. The more she investigated, the more excited she became. Jake had indeed found something that professional mathematicians had missed. His childlike approach of simply trying the opposite of what everyone else was doing had revealed a fundamental oversight in decades of research. Dr. Wong knew she had to contact Dr. Hamilton immediately. This was too important to keep to herself, and she knew that Dr. Hamilton, despite his initial dismissal of Jake, was a serious mathematician who would want to know if there was a real breakthrough in his field. She called Harvard University and left a message for Dr. Hamilton, explaining that she had important new information about the problem he had declared impossible. She didn't mention Jake's age in her message. She wanted Dr. Hamilton to look at the mathematics first, without any preconceptions about who had discovered it. 2 days later, Dr. Hamilton called her back. Dr. Wong explained Jake's approach and sent him copies of the boy's work, along with her own mathematical verification of his results. Dr. Hamilton was skeptical at first, but as he studied the materials Dr. Wong had sent, his skepticism turned to amazement, then to something close to disbelief. The 9-year-old boy who had embarrassed him at his own lecture had actually found the key to solving his impossible problem. 3 weeks after Dr. Wong's first visit to Jake's house, she received a call that would change everything. Dr. Hamilton wanted to meet with Jake personally. The famous Harvard professor was ready to admit that a 9-year-old had seen something that he and his colleagues had missed for decades. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon in Dr. Hamilton's office at Harvard University. Jake wore his best shirt and carried a folder with his original notebooks, the same ones he had filled with numbers and patterns during those late nights in his bedroom. His parents drove him to Cambridge, and Ms. Carter came along for support. Dr. Wong met them at the university entrance. Jake felt nervous as they walked through the halls of Harvard. The last time he had been here, hundreds of people had laughed at his question. Now he was coming back to meet privately with the famous professor who had called his idea impossible. Dr. Hamilton's office was exactly what Jake had imagined a professor's office would look like. The walls were covered with bookshelves full of thick mathematics books. There were charts and equations written on whiteboards and papers scattered across a large wooden desk. Dr. Hamilton stood up when they entered, and Jake noticed that he looked different than he had during the lecture. Less confident, maybe. More curious. Jake, Dr. Hamilton said, extending his hand for a handshake. It's good to see you again. Please, everyone sit down. Jake shook the professor's hand, trying to act grown up even though his heart was beating fast. His parents and teachers sat in chairs around the room, but Dr. Hamilton focused his attention entirely on Jake. I've spent the last 3 weeks studying your work, Dr. Hamilton began. And I have to admit something to you, Jake. When you raised your hand in my lecture, I thought you were just a curious child asking a simple question. I was wrong. Jake looked up at him with those bright blue eyes, waiting to hear what the professor would say next. Your idea about working backwards through prime number patterns isn't just creative, Dr. Hamilton continued. It's mathematically brilliant. You identified a fundamental flaw in how my colleagues and I have been approaching this problem for decades. Dr. Hamilton walked over to one of his whiteboards and picked up a marker. Would you mind showing me how you first discovered this pattern? I want to understand exactly how your mind worked through the problem. For the next hour, Jake walked Dr. Hamilton through his discovery process. He explained how he had started with the idea his mother had given him about working puzzles backwards. He showed how he had tested the pattern with small prime numbers first, then gradually worked his way up to larger ones. Dr. Hamilton listened carefully, asking questions and taking notes. Sometimes he would stop Jake and ask him to explain something, again. Jake could tell that the professor was genuinely interested in understanding not just what he had found, but how he had found it. The remarkable thing, Dr. Hamilton said when Jake finished his explanation, is that you approached this problem without knowing what was supposed to be impossible. All of us who have worked on this problem for years had convinced ourselves that certain approaches wouldn't work. But you didn't know those rules, so you were free to try something we had overlooked. Jake felt proud, but also a little confused. Does this mean the problem really isn't impossible? Dr. Hamilton smiled, and this time it wasn't the condescending smile he had given Jake during the lecture. It was a real smile, full of respect and admiration. Jake, with your insight as the foundation, I believe this problem can be solved completely. It will take more work. We need to extend your pattern to cover all possible cases and write formal mathematical proofs. But you've given us the key that unlocks the whole puzzle. Over the next few months, Dr. Hamilton worked with Jake and Dr. Wong to develop Jake's discovery into a complete mathematical solution. Jake couldn't understand all the advanced mathematics that Dr. Hamilton used to prove the solution formally, but he could follow the basic logic. His backwards pattern was the heart of everything. When Dr. Hamilton published his paper in the Journal of Number Theory, Jake's name appeared as co-discoverer. The paper was titled, A Reverse Approach to Prime, Number Distribution Patterns, Solution to the Hamilton Conjecture. At 9 years old, Jake Miller became the youngest person ever to co-author a paper in a major mathematics journal. The story spread quickly through the mathematics community, then to newspapers and television stations around the world. Reporters came to Jake's house to interview him. They wanted to know how a 9-year-old had solved a problem that had stumped Harvard professors. Jake handled the attention with the same calm confidence he had shown in Dr. Hamilton's lecture hall. When reporters asked him how he felt about proving a famous professor wrong, Jake always said the same thing. Dr. Hamilton wasn't wrong about the math being hard. He was just looking at it from one direction. Sometimes you need to turn around and look the other way. The discovery had practical importance beyond just academic mathematics. Computer scientists realized that Jake's backwards pattern could be used to create new types of encryption for protecting digital information. Banks and internet companies began using mathematical formulas based on Jake's insight to keep people's personal information safe online. Harvard University invited Jake to receive a special award at their annual mathematics conference. This time, when Jake walked into the same lecture hall where he had been laughed at, he received a standing ovation. Dr. Hamilton introduced him to the audience as the young mathematician who taught us that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. Several universities created scholarship funds in Jake's name to encourage other young students to pursue mathematics and science. The Jake Miller Foundation for Young Mathematical Minds provided resources for gifted children who wanted to explore advanced mathematical concepts. Jake's story became required reading in education courses around the country. Teachers learned about the importance of listening to students' ideas, even when those ideas seemed to challenge established knowledge. The story reminded educators that breakthrough discoveries often come from people who think differently from everyone else. Dr. Hamilton's attitude toward teaching changed completely after his experience with Jake. He began starting his lectures by telling students about the 9-year-old who had solved his impossible problem. He encouraged his graduate students to question everything, including his own conclusions. In mathematics, as in life, Dr. Hamilton would tell his classes, we must never assume that age determines ability or that conventional thinking is always correct. Some of the most important discoveries in history have come from people who were brave enough to suggest that everyone else might be looking at a problem the wrong way. Jake continued his education with newfound confidence. Dr. Hamilton and Dr. Wong became his mentors, helping him explore advanced mathematics while still allowing him to be a normal kid. He played soccer with his friends, went to movies with his parents, and did regular homework like any other student. But Jake also had opportunities that most 9-year-olds never get. He was invited to speak at mathematics conferences around the world. He met with other famous mathematicians who wanted to hear about his approach to problem solving. He even visited the White House, where the president congratulated him on showing that American children could compete with anyone in the world when it came to innovation and discovery. Years later, when Jake was in high school, he would still receive letters from young students who had heard his story. They would tell him about problems they were working on and ask for advice about how to think creatively about mathematics. Jake always wrote back with the same message his mother had given him years earlier. When you can't solve a problem by going forward, try working backwards. When everyone else is looking in one direction, turn around and look the other way. And most importantly, never let anyone tell you that something is impossible just because it's never been done before. The story of Jake Miller and Dr. Hamilton became more than just a tale about mathematical discovery. It became a reminder that breakthrough moments often come from the most unexpected places, and that the fresh perspective of someone who doesn't know the rules can sometimes see solutions that experts miss. Jake had proven that curiosity, persistence, and the courage to ask simple questions could change the world. His legacy lived on in every young student who raised their hand to challenge conventional wisdom, and in every teacher who remembered to listen carefully when children offered their unique way of seeing the world.